When I left Seventh Generation and sort of reflected on the 20 years I had spent there as CEO, I thought about three things that I wish we had been more effective at doing. Three things that I really wanted to sort of dedicate my future to. One of them is about public policy and the reality that the challenges that we face will not be solved without business, sustainable, responsible business getting involved in public policy. And VBSR is unique in the United States in terms of how much they participate in public policy, but that's really the exception to the rule. And it's why I helped start the American Sustainable Business Network, which is a national organization of businesses working on public policy issues. That was the first thing. Second thing was employee ownership. And unfortunately, because most businesses are not owned by their employees, the vast wealth that we create, that people like Elon Musk enjoys, end up in the hands of a very small group of people. And at Seventh Generation, we were fortunate enough to get our employee ownership up to 20% over a 20-year period. But that is not enough, and it's also not typical of the way most businesses work. And I think that when I think about responsible business, I think that employee ownership has to be part of what we think about as responsible businesses. One of the things, when people ask me, what are you most proud of in your career? One of the things that I'm the most proud of is the fact that our employees benefited significantly when Unilever purchased the company because of their ownership stake in the business. And it was transformational for many of them. Many of them were able to send kids to college. Many of them were able to buy their first home. And it was really a wonderful thing to have created a company that had that as an impact of it. The third thing, which I'm going to focus on in much greater detail, is a real challenge for the sustainable product, responsible business world. And one of the things I focus on a lot in my teaching is this idea of net positive, where when you add up all the impacts of a business, the positive impact should outweigh the negative impacts. Part of that is that obviously we need to convince more companies to be responsible that are not being responsible today. But as leaders in the industry, we also need to create a new model for what sustainable business looks like, based around, I think, this concept of net positive. There is an organization out on the West Coast that has actually a certification for net positive products. And you could take a look, if you search for net positive, you could take a look at how they actually have a measurement process that looks at their definition. So just to make another connection, the connection of employee ownership is directly connected to this idea of net positive, because employee ownership is a very positive way in which you can impact the world through the value you share with your employees. So, as is the case with public policy, sometimes when people ask me who's the most evil force in the United States, I say the Chamber of Commerce, because the Chamber of Commerce is responsible for much of the negative legislation that guides the way businesses function. And one of the problems is that we've created an entire system that is designed to encourage business to do the wrong thing. Take, for example, this whole idea of externalities. You know, if you buy a car and you drive that car and the car has emissions of CO2 and other toxic material, who pays the cost of the mess that's created by that? Well, not the driver and not the automobile company, but the public, community, the citizens, the environment. one of the most important things we need to do is shift that responsibility back to the businesses that create those problems. And scarily enough, if you were to add those expenses of those negative externalities onto the P&L statements of most companies, they wouldn't even be profitable. They're only profitable because they're taking advantage of dumping these externalities onto society and the environment. And that's a terrible, terrible problem because we've designed a system that totally legally allows them to do that. Another example, I once heard the CEO of Starbucks talk at NYU. My daughter was going to business school there, and I was curious what he had to say about corporate responsibility. And he went on and on and on about how frustrated he was because in England there were demonstrations against Starbucks for not paying any taxes. And he said, we're absolutely not doing anything illegal. We've never been challenged around the legality of our accounting and tax purposes, but we've created a system that allows huge companies to not pay taxes. What does that do to our local police departments, our fire departments? What does that do to our community at large? It siphons money away from the productive things like education and transfers them to the profits of large corporations. And that's a real problem. And they do this in really interesting ways. What Starbucks actually had been doing at that point in time, which is a little more difficult to do today, is they have a business in one country like England that is relatively high from a taxation point of view. They transfer the rights to their brand name and logo to a subsidiary in Belgium, which has very low taxes. And the subsidiary in Belgium charges the UK subsidiary with an amount to use their logo and trademark that's sort of equal to the profits that they make. So they totally wipe out the profits in England and pay a small tax in either Ireland or Belgium. And again, we've designed a system that allows and encourages this behavior. And for most companies, it's irresistible not to take advantage of these things. So we really need to change the rules by which business operates from a structural perspective. And I think we also have to be careful not to take advantage of those things ourselves as well, because your accounting firm might be encouraging you to do things that are perfectly legal but not particularly ethical. And that's one of the big challenges that I think business faces, is that business is being conducted in an environment today where it does many things that are unethical, even though they're perfectly legal. Just almost finished reading a book about Amazon. And it's a case study in what you can do to have a terrible effect on communities and small businesses that's perfectly legal. So let me pause there. I could go on and see if anyone has questions that they would like me to address. Yeah.
Do you have examples of successful public policy?
Yeah. One of the things that ASBN worked on was not aptly named, but it was called wages. And it was the public policy that has enabled much of the crowdfunding financing that is now in effect. And crowdfunding was a huge, huge benefit for small businesses, particularly ones that weren't started by wealthy, affluent people who had networks that they could raise money from. Because typically, many businesses get started by raising money from friends and family. Well, if you don't have that network, where does the money come from unless you happen to be willing to mortgage your house? So wages was one of the very successful things we helped pass. ASBN just got a $35 million grant from USDA to help transition the cattle industry to regenerative practices First, by defining a standard for what regenerative cattle raising looks like, and then helping 50% of the money goes to Native Americans to help them make this transition to regenerative. And I should say, although you probably know this, is that from my perspective, one of the bright lights from a business perspective is this whole regenerative movement. Not regenerative by itself, it should be regenerative organic. But regenerative agriculture is one of the best ways to understand what net positive is about, because the opportunity to sequester CO2 into the soil and to build soil and to avoid erosion by water spilling off the land is through regenerative farming. And many people say that if we were able to transition agriculture to regenerative farming, that alone would mitigate the increases in climate change, as unlikely as that unfortunately is. So just a couple examples. You must have questions. Yes.
I have the same question for sustainable packaging. Do you have any success stories?
One of the things I would direct you to, have you ever been to Sea Change? I haven't been. So Sea Change is something that happens in Hula just up the road. And they had a big, big meeting around packaging. And they brought together traditional packaging people like Atlantic Packaging, the CEO of Atlantic, together with people that were making packaging out of seaweed, people that were making packaging out of mushrooms, all kinds of alternatives. And they produced a fantastic white paper about the future of packaging. And you can get that from, if you go to Signal Kitchen, which is the organizer of the Sea Change event, or just send it to Sea Change, they'll probably be willing to share a copy of that white paper with you. But it was the most visionary thing that I've come across when it comes to packaging. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of brands that are just kind of getting their footing in the industry are trying to figure out where to start, because sustainability seems like such a big topic to tackle. And I think a lot of folks get paralyzed by not knowing what the first step to take is. How can you make a small shift to start down the path of a bigger impact? Do you have any recommendations, or how do you speak to those smaller brands who are really just starting out, and where do they start?
Yeah, great question. First of all, you have to think about this as a journey. Nobody is perfect. And all companies are somewhere on the spectrum of good to terrible when it comes to sustainability. So you have to understand that this is going to be a process. And every year, maybe you'll set new expanded goals, but you'll never be able to do everything that you want to do. I had many different titles in addition to CEO at Seventh Generation, but one was the arbiter of compromise. Because compromise is unavoidable. And certainly when you're starting a small company, you have to make compromises. But there are many things you can do, and these seem like such, obviously things like recycling and things like energy efficient lighting and the use of non-toxic chemicals to clean the bathroom in the office. Those are all steps in the right direction. But the most important thing that new businesses can do is think about how to design their product in a way that is net positive from the beginning, because it's very hard once you've established a product to go back and redo it. One of the reasons that my family started Sustain after leaving Seventh Generation was that we wanted to create a model for what net positive business looks like. And I actually didn't care what the product was. I wanted a model and example that other people could look at to say, how do you actually do this? So that, strangely enough, led us into the condom business. Condom business is not a business that many people grow up wishing they could be part of. No one says to their parents, when I grow up, I want to be a condom salesman. But I wanted to be a condom salesman. And the reason was that we were first able to redesign the product. So we were able to find the world's only fair trade rubber plantation. And of course, rubber, 50% of the rubber, all the natural rubber, is the sap of the rubber tree. So that in and of itself is regenerative, because you take a little bit of that sap and you let the tree regenerate it over the course of the year, and you take a little bit more. And of course, the tree is taking CO2 out of the air while it's doing that. Because this was a fair trade certified plantation, the workers were making significantly more money than they would have otherwise made. So we started with the plantation. I traveled the world looking at condom factories and found one in southern India that had just lost the Durex business and was desperate to find new clients and was willing to do things that they normally wouldn't do. Believe it or not, condoms, there's a chemical reaction that takes place when the condoms are made that creates a chemical called nitrosamine, which is a carcinogen. And you hear about nitrosamine when you barbecue meat. You hear about nitrosamine in other ways. But nitrosamine actually gets released from the condom when it comes in contact with bodily fluids. So here the FDA has approved a product that is designed in a way that releases these toxic carcinogenic chemicals into your body when you use it. And the theory behind the FDA's decision, as it is in many things, a little exposure is safe. Don't worry about a little exposure. Well, of course, that's a fallacy, because we all have the cumulative effect of exposure to nitrosamine in a variety of places, and you don't know which exposure is going to tip the scale and cause you to end up with some type of cancer. So we were able to remove the nitrosamine from the manufacturing process, which was a big accomplishment. They also use a dairy product, believe it or not, in making condoms, which we were able to remove so that we could have a vegan certified condom. And it was a product that you could look at and say, oh, here's a way in designing a net positive product. Thinking really hard about product design is really important. And it's not easy. It's not easy. And there are not a lot of people who know how to do it, because this is a whole new world. But I would say study regenerative agriculture to learn about what net positive looks like. There's also an interesting paper from a nonprofit sustainability consulting firm called Forum for the Future. Has anyone heard of Forum for the Future? They published a paper on the future of business as regenerative and just. And that was a really important addition, because we have a role to promote justice as businesses, as well as take care of the environment. And in that light, many people think of sustainability as an environmental pursuit, which I think is misleading, because the social issues around sustainability and responsible business are just as important as the environmental issues. And I wouldn't consider a business to be responsible if it only focused on environmental issues and didn't focus on the social issues that are critical. So, long answer to a short question. Yes?
I'm wondering, how can small, genuinely sustainable companies compete with larger corporations that co-opt terms like sustainable and regenerative in their marketing? And how can we educate consumers to distinguish between authentic sustainability practices and greenwashing?
Great question that I should have addressed. I think there's a couple of things we have to focus on. From a foundational place, all sustainable businesses need to be deeply focused on education. In some ways, Seventh Generation for many years was an education company more than it was a product company, because no one knew that they needed the products that we were selling until we provided them with the information that helped them understand that these products allowed them to make a positive contribution to make the world a better place. And to the chagrin of our sales and marketing people, our newsletter sold no products. Our newsletter was solely dedicated to education. And we produced all kinds of books and pamphlets. So I think every brand that's selling sustainable products needs to build education in a very significant, profound way into all of their activities. So education is one thing. Public policy is another thing. I don't know whether you participated in the critique of the FTC's new green marketing guidelines, but the FTC, and you should dig into this if you haven't, is about to revise the marketing guidelines for the use of words around sustainability. And there is a great challenge we face with the Chamber of Commerce overtaking that process and legalizing things that we know shouldn't be able to be used. So that, and I don't know if they're still accepting comments, but if they're still accepting comments on that legislation, something to absolutely participate in. And again, that's one of the things that ASBN does, which is get its businesses to participate in those open calls for information. The other thing is, I think small companies also have to be careful that they're not doing the wrong things. I find many companies not knowingly doing the wrong thing. For example, using the word natural, which has no meaning whatsoever, or non-toxic, which has many meanings, and you can choose which one you want to use. One of the rules of thumb that seventh generation follows is if we use a word that is unregulated and not defined, like obviously organic is regulated and defined, natural is not. We will not use those words without providing a complete detail around what we mean when we use that word. So if it's not defined by the government, we have to define it ourselves. And we have to define it in a way that is understandable to the consumer. And the last thing is we have to be active in challenging the large companies that are using these words that they shouldn't be using. And going to the NAD there's some law firms that are actually interested in helping out with that process because it's not hugely expensive, and this is something that the Better Business Bureau runs, to allow companies to resolve conflicts without going to court. So seventh generation had taken companies to the NAD for using language that they shouldn't be using. So it is really, really important that we use, and it sounds like a bad business tactic, but if the government isn't going to police these companies, we have to police them ourselves. And it would be a great thing for a group of companies to get together and take a company to the NAD and win as a way to let larger companies know that they can't do this and get away with it. Not happening. Not, and understandably, with all the things that people have on their plate, do they want to actually take Procter & Gamble to court? I think it tells a great story, by the way. I think from a public relations perspective, it could be a huge win to promote the fact that this little Vermont or New England company is taking these giant companies to court because they're greenwashing their claims. Europe is much better than we are. Europe is much more cautious and much more likely to take a company to task for greenwashing than we are in the United States. They're ahead of us in almost every regard. And there are many, many ways in which companies do greenwashing. I mean, the tobacco, there's a tobacco company called American, the sort of supposedly natural tobacco company. Yeah. I mean, look at their advertising. It's horrible. They're trying to convince you that their cigarettes are good for you. by using words like natural and organic and other things that people associate with positive impacts. So that's the best I can do.
In our work with large CPG companies, we frequently receive requests for quotes on sustainable packaging options, but when they see the prices, they usually opt for conventional, non sustainable plastic alternatives. These companies also cite consumer research suggesting that while shoppers claim to want sustainable options, they're often unwilling to pay the higher price when faced with the actual product on the shelves. So my question is, do you foresee this changing? Is there anything we can do to encourage both companies and consumers to bear the cost of sustainable packaging?
Yeah. And that's a challenge with the whole sustainable business movement, because sustainable, responsible companies try to internalize their externalities, and non-sustainable businesses try to externalize like organic strawberries should cost half the price of a traditional strawberry if you calculated the impact on farm workers, if you impact on polluting the water system, polluting the soil. But we live in that world. So what you have to do, I think, is be great at building the business case for doing this. And the business case for doing this takes you way beyond the world of packaging, takes you into the world of what does it do to your employee retention rate if you take this initiative? How do companies that take sustainability initiatives compare with companies that don't around that employee retention, attracting talent, productivity? You have to take it out of the lens of just this increased cost for packaging. And you have to say, this puts you ahead of what will be a huge movement against plastic. It's coming. It's just a matter of time. Even Unilever has made it one of the 3 things from a sustainability point of view that it's most focused on. So when you have a large company like Unilever making that commitment to eliminate plastic everywhere they can, your clients will be laggards if they don't start moving down this road. So, and there's hundreds of other things. You know, even employee ownership has great statistics around how much that improves productivity, retention. And you can actually look at the stock price of employee-owned companies in comparison to non-employee-owned companies. Same is true of B Corps as well. But I think that's the role you have to play. And you have to try to get the conversation away from the purchasing agent into someone who is higher up in management, who's thinking about these issues. Because if the purchasing agent isn't getting that direction from their manager and the leadership of their company, they are unlikely, because they're probably, the other challenge we face is we incentivize employees often to do the wrong thing. If we incentivize employees to sell the cheapest packaging that you can possibly find, you're basically incentivizing them not to look at sustainability as a factor. And I think from a management perspective, sustainability objectives should be built into every job description for everyone in the company, including the finance department. Everybody in the company should have their own and their departmental sustainability objectives, so the whole company is on board with this. But in addition to that, once you start making compensation tied to sustainability initiatives, everybody's into sustainability. Probably the single thing that you can do that has the most impact on your employees is tying their compensation to sustainability objectives. Or you can get me to come talk to the packaging company, I don't know.
You're hired.
Other questions? Yes.
One question regarding employee ownership. A couple of questions, and I know this can be a session on its own, but there's 2 questions I have. One, is there a sense of either number of employees or revenue level to make that worthwhile, justifying the costs and everything? And B, you said, I believe it took 20 years to get 20% employee ownership at the seventh generation. Would you advocate for 100%? Would it be 80? I mean, what are your thoughts on those two?
Yeah. So every company I've ever run, we started with employee ownership day one. And I think you can probably find the documents that you need in terms of the legal process available without spending a lot of money. So we believe in doing it from day one. Yes, there's some complication you have to deal with, but the challenges, I think, are far less than the benefits you get. So, and what we did, which was typical, is we gave stock options to employees. So they had no financial expense to become owners until they sold their stock. So in our case, our goal was to become a 30% employee-owned company, to become an ESOP. That was our goal. We would, finding the capital to buy out the current owners is not so easy to do. But there's some great organizations that are helping do that. And if you send me an email, I can connect you with a company they're a nonprofit and their sole business is to help convert companies to employee ownership. One more question.
I have a question about the challenge of consumers prioritizing performance over sustainability and how you tackle that from a marketing perspective. Have you found that integrating sustainability internally while marketing products primarily on their performance is more effective than overt sustainability focused marketing? And are successful brands moving away from sustainability in their outward comms and instead focusing on baking it in to their practices?
I know that called green hushing, is a trend among some companies. And that's in part connected to the whole pushback against ESG, which is a horrible, horrible thing. I have heard that the fossil fuel industry is willing to invest $1 billion to stop the ESG movement because they're terrified about what will happen to their stock value as more and more people and organizations take fossil fuels out of their portfolio. So that's a big challenge. But I am not an advocate of taking sustainable communication off of the packaging or your website. I think you have to do it in a very careful, thoughtful way. But NYU did a study about the grocery industry, and it compared products that were positioned as sustainable against those that weren't. And most of the growth of the category of consumer products was still coming from people that identified their products as sustainable. And we as businesses, I think, have to help our consumers navigate through this world of what they can do individually. Not that it's their responsibility, because I think the responsibility falls more on businesses than it does on individuals. But, it also depends on your competitive set, who you're competing against, what they're saying about their products. But I hope the conclusion isn't that because there's some consumers that are sort of a little cynical about sustainability claims and not buying products, I hope that doesn't win out over the companies that are committed to communicating sustainability in an authentic fashion. One of the things that I think is a challenge is I think it's irrelevant what most people think. Doesn't matter. If you're a business, you have maybe a 5% of the population or 15% of the population that you're communicating with who isn't cynical. And we have to be good marketers to make sure we're delivering our message to the right consumer if we want to grow our business. And I think there's more than enough people, even if it's not the vast majority, that still are committed to supporting sustainable brands.